This is a homage to the Buddha by Master Nagarjuna in the beginning of his Madhyamaka Karika. So today again we have this summer teaching again in Dharamsala. Not only the students who live in Dharamsala, but also there are people who have come from the foreign countries. So you should not take this Dharma discourse as receiving some kind of blessing, but that you are going through some special class. So Buddhism, teaching of the Buddha is not about just merely praying, doing some rituals and so forth, but to learn about what reality is, which is established in the teaching of the Buddha, and then from there you draw the conclusion that since we do not want suffering and want happiness, therefore we need to know what are the conditions for overcoming suffering and creating happiness. And therefore, there is no other way than knowing the reality as it is, and to combat the negative emotion. So Buddhism does not believe in a creator God and keeping a faith, single-pointed faith only in the creator God, but it goes through the basic reality of how things are, and then find from there draw the practices. And therefore there is the explanation of the ground level reality, the basis, and then the path, progression along the path, and culminating in the results. So the Buddha himself in the beginning was an ordinary sentient being like us. So for us, those are Buddhists, we having met with the Buddha's teaching, we are able to think along the lines of practices that are taught by the Buddha. And therefore, the Buddha himself, the Shakyamuni Buddha, met with the right kind of spiritual teachers, and then went through the trainings according to the teachings of his teachers, and thereby became a fully enlightened being, a Buddha. So, therefore, as an ordinary sentient being who was full of bondage, the Buddha himself reached the highest goal of enlightenment, where he became free from all defilements and suffering, and gained the full awakening or understanding and insight into everything. And so this is how the Buddhism has to go about with. We have to go about with the Buddhism and other religious traditions, of course, theistic religions like Hinduism, Islam. So Christianity and so forth, they have many followers, of course. So Christianity, 1 billion Christians, and then Islam, Muslims also make up 1 billion, and then the Hindus make up 600 million or so. And in the past, I heard that the Buddhists make up some 4 million or something. And today, it seems that there is about 400 million Buddhists in China itself. So maybe the Buddhists make up 6 or 700 million in the world today. So all these major religious traditions in the world are really beneficial to many people. And therefore, we need to respect them all. So I always say that as a Buddhist, I do not usually say that I cannot say that Buddhism is the best religion in the world, because good or bad has to be looked at from the point of view of, on account of their benefit, whether these teachings are beneficial or not, in accordance with the mental dispositions, inclinations, interests of others, the followers or not. We have to judge what is best for them or not. And the Buddha himself seems to have, had taught that the 5 aggregates are the loads, and the one who carries it is the person, and so forth, as if showing there is some kind of an independent self apart from the body and the mind. But then there are those for whom the Buddha taught the very subtle selflessness, an Atmiya theory. And so for those who were not able to take such teachings, then the Buddha taught that there as if there is a self, by teaching, by saying that the 5 aggregates are the loads, and the carrier of the load is the person. Whereas in other instances, the Buddha said that the aggregates do exist, but the self does not exist, and so forth. So this shows that the Buddha actually gave these teachings in accordance with the mental dispositions of his followers, the disciples who were listening to these teachings. So otherwise, it would make no sense, it would be of no benefit if the Buddha didn't teach in accordance with the mental dispositions of the sentient beings. And therefore, we also need to respect all the religious traditions of the world, because they help many people. And therefore, for whom one religious tradition, certain religious tradition actually suits best, and for that person, that religion is the best one. And we cannot generalize whether one religion is best or not. Although all religious traditions must be respected, but then we also, when it comes to philosophical view, the philosophical view, the Buddhism has the most sophisticated philosophical presentations or understanding. So His Holiness is asking to stop one of the fans. It's quite cool in this room. And in Bombay it was really hot, and then there's lots of humidity also. So I have sweated a lot. So if I feel hot and get sweat, then I'll ask you to turn on. So to continue, so philosophically, of course, Buddhism has really vast philosophical traditions, and especially in the Nalanda, the glorious Nalanda tradition. In those days, in the ancient times, even the non-Buddhist traditions have, scholars have really vast presentation of the philosophical treatises. So when I have met with many scholars, but it seems there are very few who have really good knowledge of the non-Buddhist traditions, philosophical-wise. philosophy-wise. And so they have a really marvelous philosophical tradition. So with regard to Samkhya and the Jain traditions, of course, our classical texts mention some of the points, but when I met with many of the scholars today, it's really marvelous. But there has been lots of decline in these philosophical traditions in India. And in Buddhism also, in regard to Buddhism also, there has been so much decline in India. So non-Buddhist traditions declined, and not because of there being because of some external forces which actually came to destroy them, but then because of lack of people who took interest in studying them. And therefore, there has been this decline. And then many of the Buddhist countries also, people have faith in the teaching of the Buddha. And we all recite the verses of taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But then many people do not really understand what the Buddha is. Well, what the meaning of Buddhism is, the teaching, the Dharma is. And so recently I was in Japan, and I met with people whom I have already connection from the past, and it was really good to meet them again. And now they have told me that they are going to start an institution for the study of Buddhism. And I also decided to contribute the kanjur and tenjur that we have in the Tibetan literature. And then the students from that monastery could come here to study Tibetan, and our monks and students can also go to their monastery to study their tradition. It's the Koyasan monastery that I'm talking about, and many. So we have made this kind of decision between ourselves. So this is a new kind of development. So Koyasan is a very important monastic institution in Japan, and it's a very big monastery. And one of the abbots of this. How much? How do you remember the age of that old monk?
92, 93.
92. So he was a very old monk, 92, 93. His Holiness thinks that he is around 98, 99 or something. So His Holiness was giving a talk in a Zen monastery, and that was a Zen, right? Zen. And so while I was giving talk and answering questions, he poured me tea or water, and then even picked up the cup for me and put water, the drink into my mouth. And so I told him that he was elder and I'm younger, and I should serve him. And then when I was resting after giving my talk, while the Japanese interpretation was going on, he gave me a massage and on my back. It was really nice. So he was really kind to me. And then the next day we had a meal, and then this elderly monk came, and so he said that the other day was his best time in his life. He never had such an experience in the past, and so it was the happiest time. And then one of the persons who asked the question asked me whether study of Buddhism is necessary or not to become a Buddha. And this same question was asked by another student in the past. And so, what one student asked me, told me that their teacher actually taught them that Buddhist meditation alone can lead them to enlightenment, and no study is necessary. So, how is that the case? And so, this person also asked me this last time, that whether study is necessary to become a Buddha or not. So, relatively, Tibetan Buddhist seems to be the best in terms of knowledge of Buddhism. But within, of course, amongst Tibetans, we have people, the common people do not consider studying Buddhism as some kind of part of it, should be part of their life. And they have faith. And therefore, it's very important for us to have, to do study. And so study or learning here doesn't mean just learning rituals. So just recently, somewhere in Europe, I think, someone told me that they were going to start so they were going to start a monastery, and then they are going to teach the monks or the people in the monastery how to play the musical instruments, such as the trumpet and the drums and the long horn and so forth. And in the past, in Galu Rinpoche's Dharma Center, I visited there, and then they actually received me by playing all these musical instruments, the trumpets and the long horn and so forth. So there was a huge fat monk who was playing the trumpet even, and so we have this idea, that impression that if you have to have a monastery, there should be some musical instruments played also. That's not necessary and necessarily true. But the most important thing is to study Buddhism. And so these days the situation is slightly better in our communities. From Ladakh to region of the Himalayan regions, people do not really think of studying Buddhism. So Guru Rinpoche is here, the one Lama from Tawang. And so people of Tawang, consider that if you get the first drop of the water from the blessed water from the vase, then you are become the most blessed and so forth. But so people really take interest when they hear that there is some kind of a initiation and some kind of a blessing from a Lama. So in Singapore once, when I went there, when I was explaining Buddhism, the Chinese audience, the Chinese Buddhists, do not really pay much interest. And so this is also the case with Tibetan. But the Westerners do really take interest. They also make notes, but the Buddhists do not really take much interest. They do not make notes. But when giving initiations and blessings, then they're really alert. So we are really doing something wrong. So when some study or the explanation of the Dharma is being given, then we don't take much interest. Whereas for blessings and initiations, we do become alert. That is actually a kind of a harbinger for the decline of the Dharma. So, of course, here you have come to listen to the Dharma, but you can also consider this as a lesson, a class in the Dharma, not so much listening to a teaching. So, you should pay attention to this. You should keep this in mind. And then, when you do study, the new generation of Tibetans, those for you, we have now been in exile for the last 55 plus years. And then with regard to the extensive study of the Dharma, I mean, there's the Gelug monasteries where they have the most prevalent study. Of course, in the past, they also the standard used to be very high, but then it has, of course, declined over the last decades. And then in the Nyingma tradition also, they do have the study of the 13 classic texts, and they do study the 13 classic texts, especially based on Khenpo Shenga's annotations. And in Mindurling Monastery in South India also, they have really, Beno Rinpoche had really dedicated himself to start the study of these classic texts and the study of philosophy and epistemology and logic and so forth. For year after year, he really worked hard. And then recently I told them that the Minderling should actually, to some of the elder monks, and I told them they should add the 3 more years to the 9 years of study that they already have, and by adding the study of the Samgraha by Master Shantarakshita and its commentary by Kamala Shinla. And so for 3 years, so in the Gelug monasteries, usually when I ask monks how many years they have spent to get the Geshe degree, I mean they tell me usually they're 22 years and so forth. So here we have some of the Geshes, the new Geshes from these monastic institutions of Gelug tradition. And so they have studied over 20 years. And so in these monastic institutions today, we have very few people who are from Tibet or are Tibetans themselves, but many of these monastics are now from the Ladakh region, Mun region, and so forth. And then since the 80s, we have had many students from Tibet. There are very few who actually joined these monasteries, who are few Tibetans who were born in India. So if this trend continues, and then we may have a situation where the pond for the study of these classic texts dries up without having the source, the source of the water, dried up. So we need to have interest first in order to have the aspiration to do studies, and therefore to develop interest, we must actually know the benefits of doing the study of these texts. And therefore, firstly, you should regard studying these texts as like a part of an academic study. So in America, I recently said that there are many people who really take interest and have found interest in Buddhism in terms of the teaching on Tibetan origination and Buddhist study of psychology, Buddhist psychology that is found in Buddhist literature. Of course, they may not think about becoming enlightened or think about past and future lives and so forth, but they find that there are lots of materials in Buddhism that they can take in order to benefit this humans, community, humanity. And when I give explanations on Buddhism, you should listen to it as part of your academic study and intellectual academic study, not so much as a dharma or religion as such. And so you should think that there is some connection with what I'm going to, what I will teach you with the academic studies. And so, with regard to this, many scientists take interest in Buddhist, what is taught in Buddhism is because of psychology. And so, in where there is the practice of shamatha and vipassana, single-pointed concentration and deeper penetrative insight, of course, there is more explanation of mind and how the function, the workings of mind. So, of course, in the Pali traditions, they seem not to have much study of logic, and then in the of course, they have the practice of Vinaya and so forth. And then in Mahayana the teachings, in the places or countries where Mahayana teaching has spread, like China and other countries, they also do not have much study of logic and epistemology. In Chinese translation, in the past, there used to be only the one text written by Dignaga, which is the door to reasoning, and other than that, there doesn't seem to have been translation of other logic texts on logic and epistemology. And so, even amongst the Tibetans, of course, in the past, Sakya tradition used to have very extensive study of logic and epistemology, but then it seems to have declined over the last many centuries, and so the most extensive study of logic and epistemology amongst the Tibetan monastic institutions is done in the Gelug tradition. And therefore, this really helps in doing in-depth analysis into the nature of things. And we are actually following the teaching of the Buddha himself, where he says, "O monks and scholars, just as gold is tested by rubbing, cutting, and burning, likewise you should examine, investigate my teaching, and analyze them, and then accept them, and not because you have devotion to me." And so, this is a really marvelous statement that the Buddha made. And so, there's no other founding teachers of the religious traditions of the world who has said this. So, the Buddha said that you should not have just faith and devotion. Faith, or you should not just believe in what I teach you, but you should actually examine and investigate my teaching, and then accept them if they really are in line with reasoning. And so this is. Therefore, I say that Buddhism is a religion which finds reality through facts. So within Buddhism, we talk about the exaggeration, which is a wrong view, and also where you actually say that something does exist where it does not. You are actually rareifying the thing, and then when you say that there is something, although something does exist, it does not exist. If you say that, then that is a nihilism, and so. This is what Buddhism teaches. We should be free from both these extremes. Whereas, of course, I'm not here criticizing other religious traditions. In Buddhist literature, such as the 400 verses and other texts, there is criticism of Creator God. So distorted views can be either the exaggerated way of looking at things, where you say something exists where it does not exist, or it can be a denigration where you say something does not exist where it does exist. And so both of these should be overcome. So we need to do analysis, we need to do examination of things, and not just leave it and be satisfied with what the teachers teach us. And so in science also, of course, because we have the better equipment and way to examine things, unlike in the past, of course, some certain ideas or concepts that were accepted in science in the past are rejected later. And so even in science, I mean, they do go through lots of analysis and examination of things. And when they find something through their experiment and analysis, then they would accept it. And not only, they do not only say that what is found by one person is true, but many other scientists also do the same kind of experiment. And then when they find the same thing, what the other person had found, and when there is a consensus of the scientists, then they accept. So this is similar to our Buddhism. In Buddhism, we accept that things are conventionally existent by way of valid cognition, that is that can actually see things in conventional terms. And so the Nalanda masters also did examination of the writings of the teachings of the Buddha himself. And when they see the certain teachings actually go against reason, then they say these cannot be taken literally. And then, whereas there were certain teachings are supported by reason, and in fact are supported by the reason and valid cognition, valid knowledge, then they say this is true and they accept them. And therefore, the great Indian masters like the Mahasiddhas, 80 Mahasiddhas, were really great masters, of course. But when we look at the teaching of the Buddha, where this general, the entire, the complete structure of the teaching of the Buddha is laid down, then we have the teachings of the 17 Nalanda masters, with whom, regarding whom I consider as professors of Nalanda. I have commissioned the Thanga painting of the 17 masters and distributed it. And so when we think about Nalanda, the impression that we get immediately is that it used to be an institution for studying, learning the Dharma, the teaching of the Buddha, and not just as where some kind of ritual is done. So it gives us this impression of being an institution for learning the Dharma. And therefore, I usually tell the monasteries today in Ladakh and so forth that they should actually emphasize studying the Dharma more, so that when the local people think about, again, the monasteries, oh, I'm going to such and such monastery, then they should immediately get this impression of going to a study center of the Dharma. So otherwise, our monasteries remain rather dusty, and then the doors, the entrance are small, low and small, and then there is part of the monastery which is considered as a protected shrine, and where people put up even the heads of dead sheep and so forth. I mean, the main part of the monastery temple, where there is the Buddha statue, of course, we do not have any kind of fear entering that, but then entering the protected shrine, we have some kind of fear developing in our minds. I mean, that's wrong. Actually, we should fear the Buddha himself, if we were to fear anyone for going against his religion and teaching. And so we need to take interest, and then that develops into enthusiasm and the aspiration to study the Dharma. And then you will actually engage in the study of the Dharma. So I've been urging for since many years that our the Tibetans, not only the monastics, nuns and monks, but even the lay people should really gain more knowledge about Buddhism. In the 1960s, our secular schools had monks, and then there was also the study of logic through debate, dialectical debate, and there were many geishis in those days. One of the teachers in Missouri was the late director of the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics, who was murdered, and when he was in the Missouri school, and the students actually had debate sessions. And so when they were one time debating in front of me, I also began to stand up and debate with them. And Venerable Gyan Lobsang Gyatsola actually said for answering, sat down to answer the questions of the, and then I debated with him. And there was quite a lively kind of debate in those days in these schools. But then that declined over the years. But we could do nothing about that. So, of course, that cannot be revived and brought back. What was done was done. We cannot do much about it. So I urge the monastic institutions like the Saturday Bungadan monastic institutions for the monks to really be able to study, to really explain the Dharma well, and therefore in these schools, in the secular schools, we have what is known as the religious instructors. Those instructors must be well learned and being able to explain the Dharma to students of the schools. And so in these schools, because people didn't find the dialectical debate to be really useful and beneficial to develop our intelligence and wisdom, and then this study of these dialectical debate also declined. Whereas in the monastic institutions like Densa Sum, they really emphasize this logical study of the teachings through debate. Because if you have doubt, then you would actually ask questions, and then accordingly there would be lots of arguments back and forth, and then you would actually bring up more questions in others, and then you will actually investigate into the teaching. Otherwise, you just take for granted the teaching without doing any kind of analysis and investigation. And so this dialectical debate is really, really helpful in sharpening our mind and bringing up questions. And therefore, today, so we have elderly people who are really doing some study of the Dharma in terms of the study of the Four Noble Truths and so forth, although they are not really able to debate on these as much, but they really have gained some good knowledge about the Four Noble Truths and so forth. I met some elderly people who have come from Tibet recently. They studied the classic texts, and then they also learned debate as well. And then some of the monks of the local monasteries had said that these elderly people should not be taught the Dharma in terms of the Four Noble Truths and the 12 links of Tibetan origination and so forth. And because the monks found that since they did not have such knowledge, these elderly people from the town actually looked down upon them because of their lack of knowledge of the Four Noble Truths and so forth. And so the monks said they should not be taught the Buddha Dharma. So amongst the 7 billion people on this earth, the, the best quality of the study of Dharma is amongst the Tibetans. This I can say for sure. And then it does not, such a study of the Dharma as we have does not exist in any other Buddhist countries like China or Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and then the Theravada countries also, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and so forth. And so you should really have a broad mind, broad thinking. So in order to, if you really wish the Buddha Dharma to really stay alive in the world, we really need to study the Dharma. Not only it will help the Tibetans, if we are not able to keep up with this, then nobody else will be a custodian to this, and then we will have nothing left in the end. And with regard to this pure and quality study of the Dharma that we have amongst Tibetans. And then through this study, we have better understanding of the Dharma as well. And this does not exist in other countries where Buddha Dharma has spread as well. So I'm now in nearly 80. And I will be 80 next year, and then maybe at the most I may stay another 15 to 20 years, and then I'll be gone. And then, of course, many of the great masters, like the Gyalwa Losang Wangchuk and Gen Nyima and Gepema Gelsen and so forth, have passed away. And so those who are still living, Gen Zangpa Lobsang is really frail and sick, and so we are really finishing the great masters who have really been good custodians of the teaching of the Dharma that we have. So the new generation, you are going to be the custodian, the next custodian of the Dharma. And so preserving the Dharma does not mean having temples and monasteries and so forth, but should I tell a story here? When I was in Ladakh last year, for about 3-4 weeks, I stayed there. And I did a retreat and recited Om Mani Padme Hum mantra. I had a really restful time. And then when I was about to leave, I went to visit the Jokang temple in Ladakh, Leh. So to visit the monastery, and when I was in there, I really became aware. So I sat in front of this throne that was put there for me. I sat on a smaller throne, and I couldn't see the Joe statue which was behind that. So it was almost like I had been there to see the throne and not the Buddha statue. So I jokingly, half-jokingly told the people gathered there that I actually seem to have come here to look at my throne and not the Joe statue, the Shakyamuni statue there. And so, since I joked to them, later on they actually had removed the throne set up for me. So when I was again in Mongolia one time, and the first time I was there, they actually made a mandala offering resembling the cosmic structure. And so it was so huge that they actually had hung it from the ceiling, and when they were making offering, they would actually bring it down, and then when the mandala offering is done, they actually pulled it up to the ceiling. So I told Ladakis that this throne that you have set up for me should also be done like that, but it should be hung on the ceiling, and then when you actually receive the Lama, bring it down, suspend it. So this custom of making three prostrations before giving teachings, when the Lama, why the Lama makes these three prostrations in front of the throne is to show respect to the teaching, not so much to the throne, because the teaching is the sacred one. So otherwise, you may consider the Lama who sits on a high throne to be really sacred, and even though not really well qualified one. And so I have another. So I'm telling you stories, bad stories, in fact. In America, somewhere, one Lama actually said he had miracles to show. So he said that he would fly. So the Lama actually said that he would show a miracle by flying, and that his disciples also requested so. And then the Lama jumped from where he was, and he broke his leg. Broke his leg. And then one Hindu sadhu actually said that he was able to levitate in water, float on the surface of the water somewhere. And then he actually announced that. And then someone set up some tank full of water. And then the Lama this Guruji was the disciple, invited, and then he started sitting on the surface of the water, floating, and that he claimed that he will float on the water without sinking. But when he sat on the water, he actually sank. And so this actually came out in newspapers. So in the 70s, perhaps, it happened. And so without much knowledge or any qualities, just sitting on a high throne doesn't make you a qualified Lama. As Master Vasubandhu said, the Dharma of the Buddha is is twofold: the scriptural and the realization and the experiences. And then the scriptures must be preserved through study. And then the Dharma, the realizations must be developed, experience must be developed through practice. And there's no other way to preserve these two Dharmas other than these two means. So today, there are people, even amongst Chinese and others, who really make huge statues of Buddhas and so forth. And then even amongst the Tibetans also, like in Revalsar, I was invited one time to bless a statue of Guru Padmasambhava. So I went there. Guru Padmasambhava, of course, is really kind to us Tibetans in Tibet. So how much this statue can actually help the Dharma. So during my teaching there, I said that, of course, I really appreciate people's efforts to build this statue, and I also make prayers. But this statue may remain for 1,000 years, but it'll never speak. And then in Japan also, there's a huge statue of the Buddha in the Japanese temple, so that also does not speak. But what we need is guidance. If it's enough just to say, I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, then we do not need this. What we need is, then maybe statues are okay, but then we need to make transformation within ourselves. For that, we need education, knowledge. And for that, we need to really hear the teachings. And then, therefore, since the statues do not speak, we don't receive guidance from them. And so it doesn't really make sense if people only make statues, split statues and big temples and so forth, which are sometimes done because people generally do not take much interest in studying. So while we still have some good masters remaining amongst us, the younger generation of Tibetans should really take interest in the Dharma, study them. And then in the future, you maybe become teachers of the next generation of our people to continue this trend of receiving teachings and studying. So that you have very vast and profound understanding of the Dharma. So by 2034 or so forth, most of us who are here may be gone, the older people. And so you would be in your 40s or 50s. And so you would be leading in the 21st century in the preservation of the Dharma, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and general Buddhism, and particularly the teaching of the Dharma that we have. This, the Tibetans, what we have to boast to others is our own Buddhist tradition. It is like our own treasure that we can cherish within ourselves, and also that can be useful and beneficial to others. And so other than this, we do not have much that we can boast about. And then the fact that the Tibetan language is also respected by others is because of the Dharma that we have, Buddha Dharma. And many people who take interest in the Buddha's teaching, sincerely, genuinely, I mean, even if they may be old, they take interest in studying the Dharma. Because this language that we have, to explain the Dharma and Buddhist philosophy, there's nothing better than the Tibetan language. And therefore, these people take interest in studying even with this Tibetan language. So if you do not know the language, our own language, then it's really shameful, isn't it? So it seems that there are more number of writings in our own language from within Tibet and not from those in exile in India. So we are saying that the Chinese are destroying our language and so forth, but we should also keep up with our own language and culture and religion. So external colorful things should not distract you. So of course English is important. So when we thought about starting separate Tibetan schools, some said that Hindi may be better for the medium of study, or others said English. And then Master Pandit Nehruji said that English is best. And so accordingly we decided to use English as the medium of our study in the schools. So in Japan, since I know many people there, I have many friends, I tell them to study English. I tell them that my broken English is really helpful. And you should learn English, and then when you know more English, you should go outside. In America, and there used to be what was known as Peace Corps, and you should also have you should go outside your country, and then you really remain very called narrow-minded. And so when you go out, you will open up yourself, and then without knowing what's going on outside and without having the language to speak with others, you remain in your country and become really called agitated sometimes, annoyed, and so forth. And so it's very important to learn English, to have modern studies of modern subjects, without which we cannot go in pace with others in the world as well. Whereas if you don't not know your own culture and language, then you would be half Tibetan. So many people without any spiritual traditions, of course, become really agitated towards the latter part of their life because of lacking anything that they can do with spirituality, although they may be well educated and so forth. And so I've been telling that secular ethics should be taught. It's important to teach in the secular field of knowledge, secular ethics. So for that, we need to know about mind. So it's not enough just to say practice of love, compassion, but we need to know about the map of mind with the different modules of mind. And then what are the different causes and conditions of the different concepts and the emotions that we have and that disturb our mind. So what are the actual causes for which causes disturbance in our mind, and what are actually the mental factors which actually go against them, and so forth. We should really have the study of the whole structure of mind. So this is only there amongst the Tibetans, and the so compared to Buddhist psychology, Western psychology is like a kindergarten level. Of course, science has really developed so much. There's been lots of progress, but those are mainly focused on material development and progress alone. And therefore, towards the end of the 20th century and the beginning of this century, many scientists, there's increasing number. There's been increasing number of scientists taking interest in the Buddhist psychology. So we have this with us since the past. So we should have both the study of modern subjects as well as psychology that is found in our own language. We do not have to resort to any other language for that. Even in terms of one's own health and hygiene, and to have happiness, to be happy in one's life, to be of help to others in the community. So the 7 billion people face difficulties because of disturbance of peace of mind. And then there's corruption, there's gap, the huge gap between poor and rich. And then we also hear lots of about gang rapes and so forth. These show lack of internal moral principle, and therefore these problems arise. And then people who are rich also exploit others. They remain selfish, do whatever is good for themselves alone. And then they when they are taken to lawsuit and legal procedures, the lawyers and the judges and so forth also sometimes make verdicts, according to to whoever gives more money to them, and so there's no honesty. And so honesty has not, it's not enough just to remain as a custom in society. Even if the law may be really good, it doesn't help in bringing honest people. So due to lack of moral principle, there's lots of killing. For example, this is going on in Syria today. And then there is also division amongst the religions. There's actually the religions, if you really practice the religions that you're following to really make progress within yourself in terms of being moral and so forth, then you will not exploit others. You will not think of bigotry and so forth. But then when you are engrossed in bigotry and so forth, then even religion is used to serve your purpose. So without knowing how to use this religion for one's own mental transformation, people are using it for such purposes. So of course, India in general is a religious country. But many of the religious people do not really use their knowledge of religion for internal transformation. People who are indulging in corruption, of course, do have some faith in religion, but then their faith in the religion is not really enough. They do not pay much interest in being moral and so forth, although they do prayers in the morning. So whether you are a believer or not, it's important to be moral and be principled. I mean, nobody can force these on you. But what happens is, if you are more moral and compassionate and so forth, then you will have better physical health, and then you will also have peace of mind. So some scientists even say that if you have constant fear and anxiety and so forth, then they actually eat into your immune system. Whereas if you have peace of mind and then a calm mind, then these are strengthened. The immune system is also strengthened. So this has nothing to do with religion. We do not have to say that these are what is taught in the Ganjur and Tenjur literature. So it's very important for us to take our religion as a subject for study. So we had discussion of what we should be taught this time. So I suggested that since these two prayers, the praise to Manjushri and also the Heart Sutra, are two texts that we actually recite every day. So I do not remember, although there is the oral reading transmission of the Heart Sutra, which I have received. I think I have received this oral transmission from Tara Rinpoche, perhaps, when I was in Tibet. And then later I received the oral transmission from Kuno Lama Rinpoche, Tenzin Gelsen. And at that time he told me that Manjushri, those Indian masters, Buddhist masters, there were 20 Indian masters, different teachers, who actually relied on Manjushri, and they had written their own prayers or praise to the Manjushri. And then when their praise came together, it was found that all of them have written the same praise to Manjushri. It was found. So regarding Manjushri, Master Tsongkhapa, he wrote a praise to Maitreya, and which was actually the sequence and the nature of the prayer and so forth were actually given to him by Manjushri. And then on the basis of praying to Manjushri, some people have vision of Manjushri and then receive blessings. So when we talk about having visions of Manjushri, some people may think that this is just fiction or some kind of a figment of mind, but I have a story to tell here. Taglung Shabdung Rinpoche came from Tibet, and when he was giving the teaching that belonged to the Taglung Kagyu tradition, so I had conversations with him, and one day he told me that he gave this Taglung Kagyu initiations to Digo Khyentse Rinpoche, and the place where he was giving these initiations, on the beam of the room, all the lineage masters of the Taglung Kagyu tradition belonging to those initiations appeared on the beam very clearly and vividly to him. So there was no reason for him to tell me lie. He had suffered so much in the Chinese gulag for 18 years, and also was old by that time. And so there are some such mystique experiences that happen to people. And then I have an American practitioner who became Gyatso later, and she has, of course, written many books on Buddhism, and so she's also writing some books, drawing materials, and from sources on the sources of Pali and the Sanskrit traditions. So she was writing this book for the people who were following Theravada tradition, because they consider Mahayana as separate and not the teaching of the Buddha. And then we, who follow Mahayana tradition, we seem to have this attitude of looking down upon the Theravada tradition, considering them as Hinayana and so forth, following the Hinayana and so forth. But both the Mahayana and Hinayana followers have the same practice of Vinaya, the monastic code of conduct. So there's a slight difference in the number of precepts, whereas in the Pali Theravada tradition now they have 220 something, and we in the Mula-Sarvastivada tradition have the 253 precepts for fully ordained monks. And then we also have the common practices of the three trainings as well. So without knowing these common practices, people sometimes make division between Hinayana and Mahayana. And so this American nun has went to Thailand several times to do some research on the Theravada tradition. And then she met one Theravada monk who told her that his own teacher, a Thai monk, so his teacher was known as an arahat in the Thai tradition, which may be an arhat in accordance with the Abhidharma tradition as we usually identify. So this teacher had a vision of the Buddha surrounded by his disciples of arahats. And since then, this teacher actually, according to his own Theravada tradition, the Buddha was said to have become nothing after parinirvana, after the last demise of the Buddha. But then, from his vision, he confirmed that Buddha still, the spirit of the Buddha still lived. So since this Theravada Thai monk had such a teacher, and therefore he began taking interest in the Kuan Yin and other deities, and so he went on a pilgrimage to China, somewhere where there is the Kuan Yin statue. So he went. So when he was making prayer in front of the Kuan Yin statue in that shrine, and he bowed down, and then as he was bowing to the Kuan Yin statue, a beam of light actually shot forth. So very unique white light, bright light actually struck on his head, and from the heart of the Kuan Yin. So as he was making his prayer, this beam of light actually struck on his, came on his crown. So, when you have a dark room and there is a beam of light, I mean, there's this very bright light, it can be seen. So such a bright light was actually appeared at that time. And so such mystical kind of phenomena can happen. So here, half yoke, half truth, half boasting. The first Dalai Lama, the Gendun Drupa, the omniscient one, had visions of deities. And then Gendun Gyatso, the second Dalai Lama, since his childhood had incessant visions of deities. And then the third Dalai Lama also had visions. And then particularly he had the visions of the Mahakala. I don't know any vision that happened to the fourth Dalai Lama. But then the fifth Dalai Lama had many visions of deities, particularly especially meditational deities, and he wrote texts also. And then the sixth Dalai Lama, I have not much to say. And then seventh also. And then the 13th Dalai Lama also seems to have good visions of deities. So all the previous Dalai Lamas seem to have visions of deities, but the only Dalai Lama who does not have these is me. But I usually say that of the 14 Dalai Lamas, I am the most famous, most renowned Dalai Lama. So I have friends, not only amongst Tibetans, but Christians, Muslims, and Hindus, and so forth. And so all these are thanks to the communist Chinese. So because they made me flee my country, I became popular. So in the past, if I had remained inside Tibet, then I would be moving to the Potala Palace in the winter, and then in the summer I would be moving down to Nobulenka, and nothing much would have happened. Would have just followed the customs. And so, of course, you, the Tibetan children in exile, over 90% of us in exile, you have gone to school, you are receiving teachers. But if you have been, if you were inside Tibet, not having this opportunity, you would be just herding your sheep or yaks and so forth. So when Mount God settlement was first established, started, Jabji Rinpoche told me that Tengtongpa was the leader of the settlement. So Tijang Rinpoche told me, I don't know who actually told him or asked him. So some people from the western part of Tibet, from Do, had come through Nepal and directly gone down to the Mount God settlement. And then these people had the impression that when they hear about the Dalai Lama, they had this impression that he was like a statue, some kind of a deity. But when they actually saw me in Mount God walking on the ground, they had actually said that, oh, Chenrezig actually walks on the ground, on the earth. And so Trijang Rinpoche had told me that so these people have said this. So if they had also heard that that I was actually having diarrhea and having problems, upset stomach, then they would also have said that the Chenrezig Avalokiteshvara also has diarrhea. So since the time of Songtsen Gampo, the emperor, 33rd emperor of Tibet, we have this very unique language and particularly the richest teaching of the Buddha. And then we also have the complete teachings or the texts written on logic and epistemology. And so we are, generally speaking, the common lay people have really low knowledge of Buddhism. They actually left it to the monks and nuns, where they actually have study of philosophy, logic, and so forth. And so, after coming into exile, our situation kind of changed for the better. So it was like a blessing in disguise. Whatever misfortune we had suffered, these are like blessings in disguise. So I was told by some elderly monk that in the past, when the monks finish their prayer sessions and go out of the prayer hall, they would actually, even the young monks, would debate with each other about the topics that they are studying. But today, it seems the monks are more involved in using their mobile phones and these gadgets. So what we should see is the benefit of making internal transformation by learning these logic and epistemology through debate, and beginning with the study of the collected topics and so forth. And it's very important for the teachers also to really relate these studies to the transformation of mind. So in the Lamrim Chemo, Tsongkhapa says that some people actually make division between theory and practice of the Dharma. Like when they say they are practicing the Dharma, they would think of doing some practice in keeping with the Lamrim. Whereas when they think about study and theory, they would just think that the monks who are doing study of philosophy are just engaged in theoretical study. And so, since the beginning of our study of the texts like collected topics in the monastics and so forth, the teachers must make sure that the students learn how to relate these studies into their own mental transformation. Otherwise, without being able to actually apply these teachings to overcome our own negative emotions, it would be like, as the first Dalai Lama said, although the spirit, the negative spirit, is in the eastern direction, you are actually offering the Dharma or the sorcery in the west. And so we should really be able to use the teachings for our transformation within. So I received teachings from Genyima, of Pramanavartika, and also the Abhidhamma Kosha. So at one point, Genyima told me that from that time onwards, he would really use a different way of style of teaching, which is not traditional. So even in the case of Lamrim teachings, as I said in the Sarah during the last Lamrim teachings, if we are not able to actually teach the Lamrim from the part, the section concerning the middling stages, concerning the intermediate teachings pertaining to the intermediate level of disciples, it would almost look like the section that precedes it looks like frightening the elderly people. So somebody told me that he actually studied Lamrim and didn't have much inspiration in him. But later on, he actually studied the Madhyamaka Avatara, and after studying Madhyamaka Avatara, then Lamrim actually made sense to him. So if we are not really careful about how to teach, then we may not be able to be effective. So when we teach about the precious human life, meeting with the Dharma and so forth, and then, of course, what if you do not know what is the purpose of the teaching itself? I mean, the teaching on the precious human life will not much sense. So the Four Noble Truths, teaching on the Four Noble Truths, is something which encompasses the entire teaching of the Buddha, and this is fundamental to the teaching of the Buddha. Therefore, Tsongkhapa says that the disciples must be led through the teaching on the Four Noble Truths. And so the teaching of Abhisamaya Alamkara also should be done within the framework of the Four Noble Truths. Because even in Abhisamaya Alamkara, it says how to lead disciples through in the instructions on the two truths and then the four truths. The two truths here, with reference to the Madhyamaka understanding of the two truths. Without understanding the emptiness, you will not be able to identify what ignorance is. And without that, you will not be able to actually identify attachment and anger and so forth that are taught according to the Madhyamaka. And then once you know these two truths, then you will see the Four Noble Truths. Because then you'll see the suffering and its cause and how to overcome that cause by understanding emptiness and so forth. And then you'll see how important it is to show the path and regarding what to adopt and what to discard or avoid in terms of the practice. And then you can go through the teaching on the precious human life, where we talk about the 8 leisures and 10 endowments and so forth. So regarding emptiness, it has to be someone, taught to someone who has good intelligence. Otherwise, you'll just think, oh, everything is empty and nothing really happens to you. So when I received teachings of Mula Madhyamaka Karika of Nagarjuna from Genyima, so some of the Namgyal monastery monks were there. They are now no more, and one of them, who is no more now, he told me that when I taught about the when I gave teaching on dependent origination, it seems to make him some sense. He seems to be getting something, but once His Holiness says, in the end, there is nothing that exists objectively, then everything just collapses for him. Nothing remains with him. And so again, this happens. Something builds up for him, a knowledge, and then that in turn goes away. So the teaching on dependent origination is really profound. You'll see things as, and then on the basis of that, you should get introduction into the Dharma. At the end of the 17 Nalanda Master Prayers, I have written that by understanding the two truths which teach how things really are, then we should be led into the teaching or the understanding of the Four Noble Truths, and thereby and have ascertainment or on the Four Noble Truths, and then gain an understanding of how to lead to nirvana and so forth. And so we should follow the Kadam scholastic tradition of Kadam. And then we can add the teachings that come from the Kadam Lamrim and the stages of the path tradition of the Kadam tradition, and then add the Kadam Mangakpa tradition onto that. So once you have a really broad understanding of the Dharma, following the Kadam scholastic tradition of Kadam, and then you will have the teachings of the Kadam Lamrim tradition. And then the pith instruction of Kadam tradition. So without having the very general the structure of Buddhism, following the Kadam scholastic tradition, you will not have a good understanding of the other traditions. So the real introduction to the Dharma itself comes from the teachings on logic and epistemology written by Dignaga, where he says, I pay homage to the one who has become authority and who is fully altruistic towards sentient beings, and who has reached the teacher, who has become a teacher, the Sugata, and the Refuge, and so forth. And then which is commented by the second chapter of Brahmanavartika. So this is just an introduction to the students here. Please turn on the fans. I feel hot. So when you receive teachings, listen to teachings, I always have this motivation to be able to beneficial to others. It's blocked by the floors. His Holiness is saying if the fans are actually able to turn around left and right, then it would help the other people on stage as well as me. Where are the fans? Those are exhaust fans, right? So His Holiness is actually criticizing the fact that we sometimes install these kind of gadgets or machines, and then when they become, when they are damaged, we don't repair them. So that's totally wrong. When they actually become damaged, then we should actually repair them or mend them. So I tell some Indians that they are quite complacent or lazy. And one of the newspaper media told me that he was unhappy about it when someone said the Indians are lazy. And then later on, the Indians, towards the time of the Commonwealth Games, there was lots of news on the news about corruption and so destruction of breach and so forth. And so I later met him and said, now what happens? And so because of laziness, we sometimes do things properly. So from the side of the Lama, I should have the right kind of motivation, genuine thoughts to help you and others. And then from your side, disciples, you should also have the genuine motivation to listen to the teaching. So you should have the motivation of taking refuge in the three jewels, which distinguishes you from the wrong path. So you should have the principle of taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha in order to distinguish yourself, so that you are not led astray by the wrong paths, which in comparison or in relation to the Buddha's teaching, the other traditions. So Buddhist and non-Buddhist traditions are differentiated on the basis of taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. So merely having the teaching the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, taking refuge, will not make you a true Buddhist as such, but mainly understanding the Dharma refuge or Dharma jewel. In other words, understanding that whatever comes through, whatever is compounded is ends in destruction. And whatever comes through contaminated causes ends in is suffering and so forth. So, of course, Adisha makes the distinction between Buddhist and non-Buddhist on the basis of taking refuge in the three jewels or not. But a genuine sense of taking refuge must arise through understanding these four, the summaries of the Buddhism, the teaching of the Buddha, which says that everything that is compounded is impermanent, everything that comes through contaminated causes is suffering, and everything is empty and selfless, and then nirvana is peace. And so Rinpoche praises the Buddha by teaching dependent origination. You help us overcome all the shortcomings. Whereas the non-Buddhist traditions, because of holding on to some kind of a theory of Atma, then they seem to intensify their own shortcomings or holding on to self and so forth. And so Jamyang Sherpa also makes this distinction between Buddhist and non-Buddhist teachings on the basis of understanding or not understanding selflessness. So refuting self and identity in things is the Buddhism, and those who assert some kind of a selfhood and a person are non-Buddhist. So we must have the also the altruistic intention to become a Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings. In other words, bodhicitta, to distinguish ourselves from the lower paths. So we usually say this prayer, I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha until I'm enlightened. So you say, you take refuge until becoming enlightened. Or here, enlightenment is Buddhahood. So the verse, these lines refer to taking refuge from in the Mahayana way. And then the next two lines say, through the practices of generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings, which shows the principle of bodhicitta, that you are thinking of benefiting all sentient beings, not only thinking of yourself alone. And therefore, in order to help all sentient beings, you say, may I become a Buddha. So you have this sense of wanting to become a Buddha, an omniscient one, and may I become an omniscient one, and that I will put effort in becoming omniscient in order to help all other sentient beings. So within these last two lines, if you just say, through the accumulation of merit, may I become, then you are excluding the wisdom part of the practice, which actually makes up with the merit to enlightenment, to go to enlightenment. And so when you come across these these verses, the term I, one should actually have a good understanding of the emptiness or selflessness. So whenever you think of I, whenever you say I, may I take refuge, may I become enlightened, or may I become a Buddha, you should be able to bring up this thought of selflessness or emptiness. So, of course, I'm not claiming to have the realization of emptiness. But since I took interest in emptiness, it's been 60 years. And since I really took a greater interest in meditating on emptiness, it's been about over 30 years. It was in the 60s when I contemplated emptiness or selflessness. I began to feel that I do not, whenever I come across in my prayers or practices, across this word, I always feel, this I does not exist the way it appears. And when I make this prayer, may the kind, precious Guru, the root Guru, come upon my crown. And then I also think about this in this way. And then in my 40s, I felt that whenever I came across this word, I, and when I actually thought about emptiness, then I felt that although things do appear to have some kind of a true objective existence, they do not have such a way of existence. And so these come through my familiarization with this concept of selflessness. It didn't come just without doing anything. So whenever you come across, whenever you think about yourself, I am doing this, or things like that, you should feel that this I, which seems like a controller over the body and the mind, although it does appear to be so, it does not have such an existence. So earlier you debated on the Abhisamaya Alamkara. You actually used the reasoning of one and many. So one of the persons actually clapped his hands when he said "Sa," actually, whereas he should have just gone. hit the back of his right hand on the left palm. So when you are able to remind yourself of selflessness, this view or the understanding of selflessness, whenever you come across this term, I, and when you say this prayer to the Buddha, Dharma, and the Supreme Community, may I take refuge until I'm enlightened through the practices of generosity and so forth. May I become Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. They repeat it 3 times. To the Buddha, Dharma, and Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until enlightenment. Through the practices of Buddha, generosity and so forth, may I become Buddha to benefit sentient beings, all sentient beings. So if you have no belief in religion, then you don't need to think about these taking refuge in bodhicitta. So the Heart Sutra, turn to page 59 for English. So in this book, they have also given the commentary written by Tendar Harampa, a Mongolian geshe. So there's not much time to go over this, go through this commentary in detail, but so the text begins with the title Jomden Dema Shirabkiparatu Chimpa, which translates as the essence of the heart of wisdom, the heart of the wisdom going beyond, or the perfection of wisdom, the mother Bhagavat. So most of the texts that were translated into Tibetan were translated from Indian language, Sanskrit, and some may have been translated, like Tantric teachings may have been translated from Nepalese. So in the beginning of the text, we usually find this title in Sanskrit, where the Tibetan translators say in the language of India, and then to show that this is a translation from India, authentic translation from Indian language, they give this title in Sanskrit. So the Bhagavati refers to overcoming the 4 maras, 4 evil forces, which can be evil forces in terms of the negative emotions and evil forces from the point of view of the 4 obscuration to knowledge. So Bhagavan usually refers to someone having the 6 qualifications or attributes. Someone is asking to the geshes what these 6 attributes are. They recited some verse, but I did not remember, he says. So Bhagavan usually in Tibetan is translated as Jomden. So Jom has the meaning of destruction, destroying, negative emotions and so forth, and Denpa has the meaning of to possess. So these 2 refers to the Buddha's realization and what he has overcome. And then the term in Tibetan also has De, Jomden De for Bhagavan. So whereas it is said that the Sanskrit term Bhagavan does not constitute the term Deva, or to be beyond, the Tibetan translation has. So what the Buddha has taught us is that our suffering is due to ignorance, and this must be overcome through knowledge. So it cannot be overcome through mere faith, mere wish, and prayers. And so what we need is knowledge of what we lack, what we are ignorant about. So those that obstruct us from, those who hinder us to reach freedom in sense of nirvana and omniscient state of Buddhahood. So our suffering of suffering comes through the lack of knowledge of causality, of lack of knowledge of law of causality leads us to lower realms of existence, and then the lack of knowledge of how things really are leads us to be born in samsara. And therefore, to overcome this ignorance, we need to develop knowledge of causality, to overcome the lack or ignorance about law of causality, and by seeing dependent origination of things, and we need to overcome the ignorance about how things really are. And so our love, affection, and faith and so forth will not counter the ignorance, because they do not actually look at the same object from different views or opposite views. And therefore, love, compassion cannot be counterforce to our ignorance. And therefore, we need to develop wisdom to reach omniscience. We need to develop the antidote to the obscuration to knowledge, and also to see that lack of self. We need to develop wisdom that counters it. So on the basis of understanding the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha's teaching is meant for nirvana. And therefore, in the Ratnavali, Master Nagarjuna says, we have two purposes or to gain or to achieve. The temporary purpose is higher rebirth, and then ultimate purpose is to reach nirvana or liberation. And here he says we have to have faith and faith and wisdom. Faith leading to higher rebirth, and the wisdom leading to nirvana. Faith here is not just blind faith, but reasoned faith. And therefore, we consider education very important in life. In order to have a happy life and overcome our miseries in life and so forth, we consider education to be very important. So this is known everywhere in the world, how important education is. And so what this recognizes is the shortcomings or disadvantage of remaining ignorant. And therefore, wisdom or intelligence is very important in Buddhism. So, perfection of wisdom So with perfection, regard to perfection of wisdom, when we actually apply the perfection to the path as an instrumental case, then that actually perfection of wisdom is within the trainee at the trainee level as well. Then when we refer it to the ultimate goal that we reach, then it is in the Buddhas. And then essence here. essence here refers to being the drawing from the elaborate explanation of the heart's the perfection of wisdom, and making the essence. So we have the 100,000 verses of the perfection of wisdom, and then the 25,000 verses, and then the 8,000 verses, and so forth. Even within these three, there is a saying that there is an extensive, middling, and then the short one in terms of the first, the 100,000 verses, and then also the same applies to the other two. So it's said that the one of these 100,000 verses of perfection of wisdom is extant in Chinese as well. So some of the texts that are in Chinese are not in Tibetan, and those that are in Tibetan are not in Chinese. So, for example, the Avatamsaka Sutra, regarding the Tibetan translation, there are 6 volumes in the Tibetan style of Pecha, and then it seems that there are more number of texts in Chinese. And so we need to really complement or have these translations done from each other's languages. And then with regard to Tengyur translations, it seems Tibetan translation is more in number, has more number of texts than Chinese. For example, the auto commentary to Madhyamaka and then the Prasana Pada by Master Chandrakirti are not there in Chinese, which are whereas they are in Tibetan. So if we could actually have these translations done, there are those that are in Tibetan to be translated into Chinese, and those that are in Chinese and not in Tibetan to be translated into Chinese, would really be a contribution to the Buddha Dharma at large. So with regard to the shorter versions of the perfection of wisdom, there are these many other texts, such as the Diamond Cutter Sutra, which is considered to be the and this Heart Sutra is the short version of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So in the beginning, when the sutra began, it was not written down. So written form actually came later. So amongst the disciples in the audience who were listening to the teachings, and during the time of the Buddha, there were those who were able to keep in mind whatever was taught. So, for example, in the case of Bodhisattvacharya Avatara by Shantideva, it was actually recited by Shantideva himself. And then there were, in the audience, masters who were able to keep all the teachings in memory. And because of the difference in their power of memory, there were 2 versions. There came 2 versions of Bodhisattvacharya Avatara. And then there's also the mention of reading again and again the Shiksha Samuchaya, the compendium of practices, and in that, in the Bodhisattvacharya Avatara. And then later on, Shantideva was consulted, and he said he had left the text in the on the ceiling or the sill of his window. So, since the number of these disciples who were able to, who had this unforgettable memory, they became less and less, of course, then the teachings were actually written down, seems to be. And therefore, during the council of the teaching of the Buddha, when the teachings were compiled, and this is said, "Thus have I heard the Blessed One. Thus have I heard once." So amongst the teachings, it refers to amongst the many teachings that I've heard, this is one. Or this teaching was not taught many times, but once, and whereby we can say at one time the Blessed One was dwelling in Rajgriha on vast of Vulture Mountain, together with one method, with a great assembly of monks and a great assembly of bodhisattvas. So monks refers to the disciples being human beings. And so amongst the audience, there were bodhisattvas in the form of deities, like Avalokiteshvara here, as it's mentioned. And then there may be others, like lay people. And at that time, the Blessed One was absorbed in the concentration of the countless aspects of phenomena called profound illumination. So regarding this profound illumination or appearance of the profound, in the commentaries that I have seen before, there's not much explanation of it. But then in one of the commentaries that I find in the Tengyur literature, it mentions. This seems to be a very good explanation of the term profound illumination. There are about 6 or 7 different commentaries on the Heart Sutra in the Tengyur collection. So this this commentary goes through 7 points in commenting on the Heart Sutra, beginning by saying how to engage or enter into the wisdom, and then giving the definition of emptiness and entering into the understanding of emptiness, and then so forth. So profound here refers to emptiness, and illumination or appearance refers to the conventional nature of things. So since in Buddhahood, both the absorption in emptiness and the seeing the varieties of things happen simultaneously, so he's able to see how things are relative in terms of dependent origination, and how things are empty of any independent objective existence. And so the Buddha was absorbed in this concentration. And then amongst his disciples in the audience, the 2 of them had this discussion. In the 100,000, 25,000 verses and 8,000 verses and so forth. Also, there are lots of discussions between the disciples of the Buddha and others. And then sometimes the Buddha also asks questions to the disciples, bodhisattvas amongst them. And then the text goes on to say, so with regard to the teaching or the word or teaching of the Buddha, there are those that were spoken from his own mouth, and there are those which are blessed teachings, blessed by him. So this particular one comes as under the second category. At that time also, the superior Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, the great being, was looking perfectly at the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom, perfect looking at the emptiness of inherent existence of the 5 aggregates also. Looking. So the term the word also is not there in the Chinese translation, nor in the Vietnamese, Japanese, and Korean translations, because these 3 translations are translations from Chinese, whereas in the Tibetan we find the mention of also So I had a discussion about this word, and I found that through discussion, I found that the term also is in the original Sanskrit. Translation. This translation is not so nice. So what this signifies is here we find mentioned that also at that time the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of profound perfect and wisdom and beheld those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. And so the term also actually has a significance because on the one hand we say that it signifies that not only the self, a person, is empty of any inherent existence, but even the 5 aggregates on the basis of which we designate a person are empty of inherent existence. So also refers to that. The five aggregates are also empty of inherent existence, not only the person. And then in the first teaching of the Buddha, he taught the 4 Noble Truths, and also in elaborating on that, he taught the 12 links of dependent origination. And in these 12 links of dependent origination, a painting was commissioned by the Buddha, where the ignorance, the first chain in this link is ignorance, is represented by a blind woman. And so the Buddha taught the process of how we lead ourselves in samsara through this chain of 12 links. But he doesn't talk about the person who is led into that. And then Buddha goes into also the 4 characteristics of suffering and the 4 characteristics of the origin of suffering and so forth. In other words, the 16 attributes or characteristics of the 4 Noble Truths. Of course, there are different interpretations of these. And so within this teaching of the 4 Noble Truths, the Buddha taught the selflessness of a person. And then in the Sandhi Sutra, it says that the Buddha gave the first noble teaching of the 4 Noble Truths, the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, where he is said to have taught that the aggregates and so forth are said to have some defined characteristic of their own. And the Buddha also gave the definitions, the particular definition or the characteristics and the general characteristics of the 4 Noble Truths and so forth. And so he taught the reality on the ground level, and then the path and the paths and the grounds. And then he also touches in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, he touches on the ground level, and then the path of the bodhisattvas and so forth, and then the resultant state of omniscience or Buddhahood. And so after having touched on all these, in the end he says all these do not have any ultimate existence, independent existence, but they are conventional. And so this second turning is called the turning of the wheel of Dharma, called the the teaching on characterless or devoid of characteristics. And then the Sandhi Sutra also regards the Sandhi Sutra itself as the third teaching of the third turning of the wheel of the Dharma, where the real import of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras of the second turning cannot be understood by certain disciples. For them, this was given. And so the Sandhi Sutra says that the Buddha taught during the second turning of wheel of the Dharma the more profound level of understanding reality, that things do not have any characteristic and so forth. So that may be considered as a reference to this text. Then, through the power of the Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, the great being, and so forth. So, with regard to the historical account, so what is found in the Pali tradition, the three Pitakas do not include the teachings of the Mahayana teachings that were given by the Buddha. So historically, we do not have these the record of these teachings in the three councils of the teaching of the Buddha. And so, as I said earlier, how Dalung Shabdrung Rinpoche had the vision of the lineage and the root lamas of his particular initiation that he had, although the people who were in that room, of course, did not have the same vision, but someone who has the inner quality, the realizations and experience of the Dharma to a certain degree can have such visions. Not everyone can have the same vision. So similarly, the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths popularly. So it was taught in a language that was known in India at that time by everyone, understood by everyone, but later it was actually compiled amongst the teaching in the Pali tradition, in the Pali language, whereas the Mahayana teachings were given to a very specific select disciples. And I usually say that when the Buddha was giving the perfection of wisdom teachings, and at that time Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara had this dialogue, those who can see Avalokiteshvara would actually have access to this discussion between these two personalities. Whereas those who didn't have access to Avalokiteshvara, to them what would appear is the Shariputra was talking to himself alone. And so those people would think that the beings in the audience would think that, oh, Shariputra may not be so well today, because he was talking to himself alone. They would not have seen or found that Shariputra was also even actually having dialogue with Avalokiteshvara, and therefore the Mahayana teachings were not given popularly, but to very select disciples. And therefore Bhavaviveka says that he argues against the criticism that the Mahayana teachings were not compiled by the Arahats during the three councils. And the Bhavaviveka's response is that they were compiled by the Bodhisattvas in deity forms. So, in the eyes of a very specific person who has a very pure karma, such things can happen. The visions of deities can happen, although these kind of teachings cannot be accessible to those who do not have such pure karma. And therefore, the Mahayana teachings were not compiled in the Tripitaka that we find in the Pali tradition. And therefore, Bhavaviveka in his Madhyamaka Hridaya, the essence of Madhyamaka, actually deals with these, argues for Mahayana being the teaching of the Buddha. And also other texts like Mahayana Sutra Alamkara and Shantideva's texts and so forth do argue for Mahayana being the teaching of the Buddha. So mainly because there was this criticism or the argument that Mahayana teaching was not taught by the Buddha came very early on in Buddhism, is because these teachings were not accessible to other people in public. So I once knew an Hungarian scholar who said that the Buddha could not have taught in Sanskrit because he didn't know Sanskrit. I didn't respond to him, of course, but the prevalence of using Sanskrit in writing texts may have started since the time of the Master Nagarjuna and so forth. Before that, people used Pali, perhaps. And so we have the teachings given by the Buddha in Sanskrit. Perhaps it was in the 1980s. I have a story to tell here. There was a meeting. I was called there, invited, and there was discussion about Mahayana being not a teaching of the Buddha, and so I said, Master Nagarjuna accepted Mahayana being the teaching of the Buddha, the words of the Buddha. And historically, Buddha Nagarjuna appeared only about 400 years after the Buddha's passing away. So someone who appeared around 400 years after the Buddha would know the history better than people who have lived today, which is a time when it's 2,500 years or so have passed since the time of the Buddha. And then secondly, the story of Buddha, regarding the story of the Buddha, someone who is Indian would be more knowledgeable about it. And then thirdly, I said, Nagarjuna was not any person, any ordinary being. He was someone who actually did analyze and examine the teaching of the Buddha itself through logic and reasoning. And therefore, and then he was also someone who is a scholar in the 5 subjects. He wrote the text Mula Madhyamaka Karika, the fundamental wisdom treatise of the Middle Way, and then the other texts which use reason and logic of reductio ad absurdum. And then his disciples, Aryadeva, also used reason to prove things. So they were known. It's very clear that they knew logic. And then their writings in Sanskrit are found to be really marvelous by the Sanskrit scholars today. And also Dharmakirti's Pramana Vartika. So they were written in a very fine Sanskrit, they say. So their style of writing is seen as amazing. So by Indian Sanskrit scholars. And then Master Nagarjuna was also a monk, a pure, who kept his vows purely, who upholder of the Vinaya. So Master Nagarjuna was someone who was not really someone who took the words of the Buddha for granted. And so he was an intelligent, very clever, intelligent person. And since he recognized or accepted the Buddha's, the perfection of wisdom to be teaching of the Buddha, So when you see the explanation of the Four Noble Truths and the Perfect Wisdom Sutras and so forth, from the according to the Nalanda masters like Nagarjuna, Dharmakirti, and so forth, I mean, they really give you really firm, strong conviction in the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. Merely resorting to the words of the scripture itself, of course, you may think, oh, this is what the Buddha has said, so it must be true, and so forth. But this is not the case. If the Mahayana were not the teaching of the Buddha, as far as I'm concerned, if this were the case, then we would have to say that the Nagarjuna was more knowledgeable than the Buddha. There's no other way. So when the Buddha taught, in our sutras, we find the Buddha repeating himself over and over again. Whereas Nagarjuna's writings, when we read them, we would find them like clear-cut and without repeating over and over again. So regarding the teaching of the Buddha, we cannot take that as an evolutionary process, that the Buddha came and then the later masters kind of added more and more, made them the teachings more sophisticated and so forth. So the Buddha coming first, giving teaching, and the Nalanda masters elaborating on his teachings, and then so of course evolutionary process has happened to the world and the species living in it, but if you think about the religion as something similar and following some kind of a similar process, that won't work. So the Buddha became enlightened first, and then from his own experience of the varieties, the multiple things and the multiplicity of things, as well as the reality as it is, then he gave his teachings. And therefore, if we were to say the Mahayana is not the teaching of the Buddha, then there would be lots of contradictions, logical contradictions you would have to face. So understanding the import of the Four Noble Truths is much more profound if we look at the teaching of the perfect wisdom and so forth. And so, just as the sunshine makes the flowers open, the lotus open, this verse says, "I pay refuge in to the Buddha, who gave us the teaching to open our minds, like the lotus opening when the sun shines." So just as the sun shines, the sun rays make the lotus open, bloom, because the lotus itself has some capacity to, or chemical thing, capacity to open when the sun shines, and then this happens. But then it says that although there are many other teachers, but the only teacher who taught dependent arising was the Buddha himself. So even those who criticize religion, if they really understand dependent origination of things, I mean, they would have really no criticism. And so this is clear from even from the quantum physics. So the more you understand about dependent origination of things, the more you become closer to the teaching of the Buddha. So this is what I can say. So his words shines forth in the world. So therefore the Buddha is a unique teacher. As Rinpoche also says, following what I had quoted earlier from Rinpoche's in praise of teaching dependent origination. So a wise one sees the difference between the teaching of self and non-self, and therefore, from the depth of my heart, I pay respect to you. So otherwise, as Gendun Chömyol says, how do you know a Buddha is sacred? The answer would be, Nagarjuna said so. And then how does Nagarjuna know? Then my teacher taught me. And how do you know that your teacher is sacred or holy? I know. Then that it would be like. And so he said that as a witness to this lion, and you would have fox, and as a witness to the fox, you would have a dog, and so forth. So otherwise, what I'm trying to say is that you would have to say that I consider my teacher to be sacred, therefore what he says is true, and so forth. That's not the case. We need to use reason and logic to actually prove how the Buddha is an authoritative person in terms of knowledge of the Four Noble Truths. So it's not just enough to say that the Buddha is full of the marks, 32 and 80 major and minor marks, and therefore he's sacred, but we need to find the Buddha to be someone who can be taken reliable in terms of his teaching through logic. So proving the teaching of the Mahayana to be the teaching of the Buddha must be done through logic. And then Tantra, of course Tantra is also there in non-Buddhist traditions. In Gorakhpur, I met one non-Buddhist Tantric practitioner. When in discussions with him, I learned that they also have the practice of holding the vast breath, and also the projecting the mind out of the body and transferring it into another person's body and so forth, another being's body. And then they also have the practices based on the using our inner vital energies, drops and energy, and also Sandalini and Kundalini practices are there in the non-Buddhist tradition, according to him. And so the differentiation between the non-Buddhist and different Buddhist Tantra is the understanding of selflessness. So in all the Buddhist Tantric practices, we always come in the beginning of the practice, Swabhava mantra. In the Hindu tradition, they do not reject this Atma theory. So the Buddhist tantras are practiced on the basis of the practice of understanding of the rejection of Atma theory and selflessness. And so we have Buddhist Tantra. So, as it is said in the Pali system, that the Buddha was an ordinary person when he first was born, and then from the under the Bodhi tree he became enlightened, beginning with where he went through the process of realization of the path of preparation and so forth. And then becoming enlightened under the Bodhi tree at the end. Whereas so what this theory says is that the Buddha was an ordinary person, and then became enlightened at the age of, left his royal life place at the age of 29 and became enlightened under the Bodhi tree at the age of 35, and until 84, until the age of 80 or 81 he lived. And so Master Nagarjuna says that if you were to say that someone becomes both an Arahat and a Buddha with the same path, the 37 factors of enlightenment, then since there is no difference in the course, there shouldn't be any difference in the resultant stage as well. Whereas there is huge difference between a Buddha and an Arahat in general. And so we need to go through the four-fold Buddha bodies, the four kayas, which must come through its own courses, compatible courses. So in Tantra, so just as in the Sutrayana, we talk in the Four Noble Truths teaching, because there is the ground reality of how things are, therefore we can talk about the path developing and on the basis of that, and then going along the path and reaching the result or goal. And so similarly in Tantra, it's said that the fundamental substantial cause for Buddha's mind and the body are in the innate clear light, or the mind and the energy that goes with it, the prana energy that goes with it simultaneously. And so in one of the Tenjur catalogs, I found mention of the Tantra, arguing for Tantra also, Buddhist Tantra, to be the teaching of the Buddha, just as we have the argument for the Mahayana teaching, that the Sutrayana teachings to be the Buddha's words. And then Shankarakshita has written the Tattva Samgraha Prakarana, and he also deals with the Tantra being the teaching of the Buddha, arguing for the Tantra being teaching of the Buddha. So if we really find conviction based on all these teachings, then it will be really stable knowledge. Guru Rinpoche, come along with us, he says. Not go before. And then so our Shariputra asks, son of the lineage, how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of perfection of wisdom? And then the answer is given by Avalokiteshvara. So regarding the son of the lineage, His Holiness was earlier commenting on the Buddha nature that we have, which is the seed for Buddhahood. And then next comes the definition of emptiness, which starts with the passage, form is empty, emptiness is form. The meaning of the emptiness, definition of emptiness. Form is empty, emptiness is form, means. So emptiness doesn't mean that there's nothing to be found, just as we talk in quantum physics. But form is empty, has to be really thought through. We cannot say that the form is not findable when we really search for that designated object, which is called form, and therefore there's no form and therefore there's emptiness. This is not the case. because what does not exist cannot be emptiness. So emptiness here can be understood in different ways. The 4 different philosophical schools within Buddhism have different understanding or interpretation of emptiness or selflessness. So the Madhyamakas who do accept some kind of objective existence in things, in ontological status of things, for them, if we say that form, the nothing exists objectively, then they are not able to posit what form is. So Master Nagarjuna gives the different positions of the other philosophical schools. And then in the Mula Madhyamaka Avatara says that emptiness does not mean. And the other philosophical schools say that if things do not have their identity, then nothing can be posited. They cannot be the 4 Noble Truths and 3 objects of refuge and so forth. Nothing can be posited. But when Master Nagarjuna responds to them, the fact that the Buddha taught that nothing really exists as having some kind of a self-existence, he says that in the sutras, it says that what arises through condition has no arisal, no birth. And therefore, what he says is that when we talk about emptiness, we are saying that nothing exists by way of their own existence, but they are dependent. And therefore, there is nothing that exists independently. And so he says, whatever is dependently arisen is empty, said to be empty, which does not mean that emptiness means nihilism, that there is nothing. And then he goes on to say that that is the designated through dependence, because there are things are designated through dependence. When dependent through designation, therefore they are dependent and not independent, because they rely on other factors for their existence, and therefore dependent origination is the reasoning to prove that nothing exists by way of their own characteristic, and it also does away with nihilism. So it does away with both the extremes of eternalism and nihilism. But from our experience, if we look at things, they do appear to have some kind of objective existence, whereas the flower and so forth, the shape, color, and so forth, come through many factors coming together. And then we also label these objects, and then they are renowned as being this and that conventionally. And therefore, nothing exists the way they appear to us, but they are conditional. And therefore, it says in the text, emptiness is empty. Because things are dependently origin and not independent, and therefore they are devoid of any nature on their own. And therefore, they are dependent. And therefore, we can say that things have parts, a whole and a part, and its parts can be talked about. Whereas if things were to have any kind of concrete, solid, independent existence, then we cannot talk about parts and whole. And similarly, cause and effect are feasible, although a cause does not arise from the effects that it gives rise to. But because there is an effect that it gives rise to, something is called a cause. Because if there is nothing which can be given rise to by another thing, you cannot talk about a cause or an effect. An effect. And if there is no effect as such, then you cannot talk about a cause which has given rise to it. And so whatever we take, whether the 3 times, the past, future, and present, or anything, if we understand that they come through causes and conditions, they come in dependence on other factors, And then, the good and bad, and being beneficial or non-beneficial, harming and so forth, can only be posited on the basis of understanding that they are dependently originated. And then similarly, action, actor, and what is acted upon, and so forth. And therefore, the Buddha's intent or thought, which is commented precisely and correctly by Nagarjuna, can be understood through this. As I said, earlier, the Buddha goes through in the Prajnaparamita Sutras the form and so forth, the paths, and then the grounds and the result. And then in the end, he says there's nothing that exists absolutely, but in absolute terms, but they are merely in convention. And so, Master Nagarjuna says a person is neither the earth nor wind and so forth, and even down to the consciousness. But if person is none of this, what else is a person? And then he goes on to say a person is designated on the basis of the 6 constituent factors. And therefore, since a person is designated on the basis of these 6 constituent factors, a person does not exist objectively, independently. And therefore, dependent origination gives you the understanding that there's nothing objectively existing, and it also saves you from nihilism. So when you see whatever you see as having some dependent on other factors, then you can see that they lack any kind of independent arisal, independent existence. And therefore you can say that, of course, this is true with good or bad. And so these appearances also give you the understanding that there's nothing independently existing, objectively existing. So this should not just remain on it doesn't help just to say this in words, but I'm saying this from the experience of having done this kind of analysis for the last 40, 50, 60 years. And therefore, when I think about the teaching, the view of emptiness and bodhicitta, then I feel the Buddha is really kind, really an authoritative and not a reliable person. So maybe I'm contemplating on these 30, 40 times a day. So they really help you. So it does not make you depressed. And one of my friend Geshe said he had become depressed, and because he actually developed this strong fear when he thought about the impermanent nature of things. So of course the teaching of the Buddha is never to cause fear in us at all. But when you see that this ignorance is the cause of suffering, and therefore if I can really combat it and destroy it, that it is worth putting any effort in doing that. And then, I gain this kind of conviction in the teaching of the Buddha on the basis of understanding this emptiness. Of course, I'm not trying to say that I have still realized emptiness and so forth, but for the last 40, 50, 60 years, I have really gone over this. So I always feel relaxed, calm, and I'm not concerned with formality at all. And so the dependent origination gives me this courage to be informal, and whether whether other people are Buddhist or not doesn't matter. So I'm not concerned. I do not have any kind of anxiety. In the past, when I was in Tibet, of course, I had to relate with Chinese, and there were cases when I feared things or I had to be really cautious. So our concerns usually happen, anxiety, fear, and nervousness happens because of selfish attitude, selfish motive, and also because of holding on to things having some independent, solid existence. And then, when also I'm moved by the very practice of bodhicitta, thinking that without this exchanging of self and others, I mean, even in samsara, you will not have peace and happiness, leave alone attaining Buddhahood. So this gives real courage to me. So Buddha's teaching is based on reason and not just mere faith. And then when you develop the real knowledge and then on bodhicitta, then you will also be thinking of dedicating yourself for the benefit of others, just as Shantideva says. This bodhicitta, which does away with one's despair and takes you, this horse takes you from bliss to bliss, and which intelligent person will not develop this, which reject it? Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, and not fulfilled. So this is about the definition, meaning of the definition of emptiness. And then next is the explanation of the meaning of the wisdom's objective domain. So Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, and no composition factors, no consciousness, and no phenomena, down to no phenomena. So I have a story told here. There were two Amdo people, and one knew the Heart Sutra by heart, and the other one did not. And then the one who knew, the first person actually recited in front of the other one who didn't know the Heart Sutra by heart, just as a boasting. And then the second person actually at the end said, at the end of this recitation, he said, you didn't have to say there's no eye, no ear, no nose, and so forth. You could just have said no head. Just simply, there's no head. So there are various reasonings that are used to prove emptiness, such as the diamond splinter reasoning to establish the emptiness of the basis of cause in relation to causes, and then the lack of one and many to establish the emptiness of a nature of things, and then and so forth. But the king of reasoning to prove emptiness is dependent origination. And then, similarly, there's no suffering, origination, cessation, and the paths teaches the Four Noble Truths, and then there's no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and no non-attainment. And then Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. And then all Buddhas dwell in the three times, also manifestly completely. To the end of this passage shows the resultant stage. And then the benefit of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra. So all the Buddhas have become enlightened on the basis of the perfection of wisdom. And the present Buddhas also become Buddhas for the through the perfection of wisdom, practicing the perfection of wisdom, and then the future Buddhas will also arise through the perfection of this wisdom. And so we are included amongst the future Buddhas, those who would become Buddhas in the future. So we should become Buddhas through this practice of the profound perfection of wisdom.
아니 달렌다의 남과저 수비 아니 바꾸다 되게 꾸대 속에 나오는 이 this pasta this ama
So the question basically is that he finds the different statues of the Buddha, images of the Buddha that are built in the Tibetan tradition, Thai, Theravada, and other traditions different. They seem not to be the same image. So which kind of Buddha's shape of Buddha image is correct? Because we say that the Buddha is only one. There was only one Buddha who appeared in India, but we have many different images of the Buddha, different shapes of the Buddha. So due to the artisan skills, of course, so we have, of course, in the art the different measurements that are given for making the images of the Buddha, and there are peaceful and wrathful aspects of the Buddhas and deities also. And so with regard to the deities, of course, there are different meditational, special meditational deities, such as the three deities of long life, such as Amritayus. And then there are deities of wealth and so forth. So there are many different tantric deities in different forms of the Buddhas. So when we make images of the Buddhas, it's very important to be really precise and, be careful with the images. When people make these images for business purpose and draw the images of the Buddha very quickly and without really proper rules, lines or measurements, then it's really... So if you are careful in making the right kind of image with the right measurements and so forth, then of course even if you make some mistakes here and there, that's not so grave. But if you actually think of making a statue or image of a Buddha for commercial purpose, then of course it's not so good. So with regard to the teaching of the Buddha, we have only one teacher, the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, who appeared historically 2,500 or so years ago. But there are on other forms of Buddha. So when we find people grieved because of loss of their parents or their near and dear ones, what should we do? What kind of practices, Buddhist practices we can do for them to be able to help them? So as Master Shantideva says, if there is a solution to the problem, then why be worried and unhappy about it? If there is no solution, what is the point of worrying and being unhappy? On a practical level, the 7 billion people, amongst 7 billion people, there are many who actually go through such grievance. And you will feel, when you actually compare yourself, look at the world at large and think that there are many people who have the same kind of experience and sadness and sorrow. I mean, why it is only me, who should be so sad? And so I usually tell these kind of things to those who do not have much faith in Buddhism or in religion. And then in Buddhism and other some of the religious Hindu traditions, we believe in reincarnation. So death is part of our life, existence, and therefore your parents and those who have been kind to you and who have been dear to you, heart, and when they pass away, you should think of them and do prayers and so forth, so that you are able to help them from life after life. So for Buddhists to have a meaningful life, which means to be of help to others, beneficial to others as much as one can, and even if you are not able to help others, benefit others, at least not to harm them. And then you would not have any regret, and then there is no sorrow for those who are left behind. And so of course you can think that if the person was still alive for at least few years, it would be very good for them, because they could have continued such practice, but they are no more here. But by actually being feeling overcome with feelings and sorrow and so forth, it doesn't really help anybody. And so you open up your mind, look at the world and see the things from a broader perspective. And then the suffering of age, birth, sickness, and called death are the part of what is known as the suffering of suffering. So the more you feel unwanted, undesirable, the suffering of suffering, you should also have the feeling, same kind of greater intense feeling for the existential pervasive condition suffering as well. And so as long as you are in samsara through the force of our delusions and karma, of course there's going to be suffering. And on the other hand, you can also use the suffering, use that as an opportunity for cultivating the path to enlightenment, path to Buddhahood as well. So in this way, one can make one's life meaningful. So in this prayer that His Holiness was mentioning in the beginning, through the practice of generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha until I become reached Buddhahood. May I become a Buddha which says I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha until I'm enlightened. So what if one becomes enlightened? So once you become an enlightened being, you would know that others who are not enlightened yet would seek refuge in you. So you become someone who is an object of refuge. But so although you may not have the sense of taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha as such, you would still know others can take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. We'll continue tomorrow. Did I use? His Holiness wanted these guys not to be in the picture. These guys, Tibetan, from Tibet.